Hey everybody, this is Brett Hancock. Hey, just want to do a video here. I was doing some research, doing some thinking, doing some studying, and some thoughts came to mind. I said, this might actually help somebody. Let's put this down on a video and upload it to the channel. But anyway, it has to do with the idea of the Bible talking about temptations and testing and that kind of stuff. And just by studying Greek, I've seen that there's two major words, and I'm not going to go into Greek here. This is not a Greek video, but the ideas I do want to talk about, and that is one of the words conveys the idea. It comes from the root of the word that has to do that we would translate in English to say, hey, I'm trying to do something. I'm trying to XYZ, whatever. I'm trying to go. I'm trying to study. I'm trying to eat. I'm whatever. I try, right? So in English, I think in times past we used to kind of use that word more, where we would say I'm going to try this person to see if they pass the test or whatever. We don't really say that so much anymore. We used to when I was a little bit younger. I remember hearing that a lot more, but now people typically use the word testing. They say, hey, I'm going to test this person or whatever. And yet the word in the New Testament for Greek that we would translate as testing is actually a different word. And I want to talk about the differences in those words. So maybe you can recognize those, because there's a little bit of a difficulty for whatever reason. A lot of translations, and I know people that usually are King James onlyists will say, well, not the King James, maybe the other translations, but not the King James. It's just, in this case, it's just they all do it, right? And they're actually taking these words and they're inconsistent about translating them to the same word. So if the word that had this one root that has to do with I try to do something or whatever, or being tried, if they would be consistent, whether it's they translate it as trying or they translate it as tempting, but sometimes they'll actually translate it as test, instead of tempt. And so there's kind of a mixing up with those, so that can kind of confuse people, because when they're looking at the context based on what I'm about to share with you, you might see some inconsistency there. So I just want to draw your attention to that. If you see the inconsistency, if you know how to use a Greek, interlinear, a Greek lexicon or whatever, maybe you can dig into that and see exactly what I'm talking about. Otherwise, you can at least detect it and see these two different categories. So let's talk about them. So one of them is this idea of truly testing, right? Because the scripture says that God doesn't tempt anyone, right? That's what James is talking about, the epistle of James. Epistle from James. He says that God doesn't tempt anyone, right? But it's not conveying the idea that God does not test anyone, okay? So let's talk about what's the difference, okay? Let's look at it from this point of view. The Bible teaches, especially the New Testament talks about this more, that when demons or when, Satan or when the kingdom of darkness is tempting someone, they're actually using something that in and of itself is wicked, right? Let's say, for instance, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 that if a man is lusting after a woman, he better stop. I mean, I'm going to paraphrase here, but he better stop is the implication. Otherwise, he's going to get cast into Gehenna, or cast into lake of fire, or some translations might say cast into hell. And so the implication is that he needs to do something radical. Whether that means cut off his hand, pluck out his eye, but do something radical. It's like get rid of that TV, get rid of that computer, get rid of internet, whatever it is you got to do, move to a different city, whatever, quit that job, whatever, so that he can get rid of that temptation. Ultimately, that's a temporary solution, because the heart needs to change. A hatred for what God hates and a love for what God loves is what needs to happen. But sometimes in the interim, removing the temptation can help give time for maturation. That whole process of growing up in our salvation and stuff can occur, and it can certainly help remove the stumbling blocks and stuff. So, but in and of itself, when the kingdom of darkness tempts people, they're using something in and of itself that is evil. Like, so basically you could say where the scriptures talk about, an entity, whether it's an angel, fallen angel, apostate angel, or whether it's a human being, but causing somebody to stumble. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 13 that woe to them, because when, he's conveying that idea, doesn't say that quote unquote, but it's conveying that idea because he's saying, as he's explaining this parable about the wheat and weeds, that when he comes back with his holy angels, that his angels are basically going to gather up everyone that cause others to stumble. In the King James translation, use the word offend, like the offense that causes somebody offense, but it's causing somebody to stumble, that they're going to be cast in the lake of fire. And so that's what we're talking about. This category of distinguishing between the testing that I'm going to talk about, an example of God testing Abraham, and how what God did in and of itself was not evil. That's the distinction between that God does. He tests every human being, versus the testing that is really tempting that the evil kingdom of darkness does. So if a kingdom of darkness entity, whether it's an angel or a demon or whatever, but lures a woman to really doll herself up so she becomes this really lustful, appetizing sort of thing that Jesus says in Matthew 5 is committing adultery in her heart, and she dressed immodest in a way, maybe it's real tight clothing, maybe it's low neckline or whatever to show her body, or really tight pants or whatever, that is really tempting human beings, that the evil demon, angels, apostate angels, whatever, Satan is using her. So they're working together, whether she realizes it or not. She's getting her satisfaction through vanity and psychological income kind of thing or whatever, that is just wicked. Jesus says that's adultery, that this person, that the man is going to commit in his heart as a result of that. So she's actually the agent, the medium that Satan is using to actually bring the fall down on this person. So that test in and of itself is wicked. Obviously the conclusion is adultery in the heart. They're both wicked, right? So that's a distinction from what we're talking about, where the words in Greek will clearly make a distinction there, where God is testing somebody. So when God tests somebody, he doesn't, in and of itself is not evil. So when he tested Abraham, we see in Genesis 22 and Genesis 21, he called him to sacrifice his son, right? And it's revealed later in chapter 22 that his intention wasn't for him to sacrifice his son, because the scriptures say in the Old Testament, God takes no delight at all in child sacrifice or whatever. But since the pagans did that, and Abraham grew up with his family all sacrificing to, growing up around idols and worshiping idols and that kind of stuff, his whole environment that he grew up with, because the scriptures say he was the only, person that was, righteous, that was really doing, that was really righteous and that's why God called him to leave his home, leave, or whatever, to call him out, because he was the only one. It's kind of similar when you're reading the book of Job, that in the time frame of Job, he was the only one, or even in the time frame of Noah, he was the only one, or whatever. So I guess there was a lot of that sort of thing happening in those times. Even when we read about Elijah, which is, I don't know, arguably 1,000 years later or something, but much later, that Elijah was the only one in his time frame and stuff. So, but in any case, with God testing Abraham, what he was doing in and of itself was not evil. He's just saying, hey, here's the command I'm giving you. Let me see if he actually does it, if he's willing to actually do this. And of course he stopped it because he had no interest in that happening. But he gives him a command. And so I was just thinking about it. It's like a similar sort of thing would be, the teachings of Jesus. Jesus is giving us commands, saying, love your enemies, do good to others. See, those tests in and of ourselves to see if we'll obey, in and of itself is not evil. It's actually good. And the if I can use the word consequences of that, the result of that, the fruit of that is actually good, because God is actually using us when we'll obey. He's testing us to see if we'll obey. But if we obey, it's actually sanctifying us. It's actually making us more and more, molding us in the image of God as we're obeying, right? The flip side of that, going back to the other word we're talking about, that you could, again, translate as tempt or try somebody or whatever, that it's, by context in a particular passage will convey the idea that it's the kingdom of darkness doing this. And then possibly, it might actually, in the context, show that a human being is cooperating, and it's implied that it's a kingdom of darkness in the background, but in the foreground, it's actually a human being that is actually causing people to stumble. If people give in to that, let's say, for instance, like Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, that if a person lusts after a woman, he commits adultery in his heart. So God has infused and designed consequences to happen in nature of some sort or whatever, that one of those is that instead of the person being molded by obeying God to do good, molded in the image of God, the contrast to that happens. It's almost like the difference between light and dark. God has designed in nature for us to pay attention to these differences and stuff. And so the person is actually being molded more and more like Satan. He's becoming more and more dark. His heart gets darker and darker. So this is why you got somebody that starts out as a pure baby, and then 40 years later they're on death row in prison, and people are classifying them as schizophrenic or whatever. They're so full of demons because they practice so much evil in their life that they increasingly taking on more and more demons and being molded and shaped in the image of Satan and stuff. So one of these categories is temptation. That's where in and of itself is causing people to stumble and do evil. And if people give into it, the consequences actually bring them to be molded and shaped more and more like Satan. The contrast to that is when God calls us to do things, to obey him. If we do that, he's testing us to see if we will. And if we do that, we actually bear the fruit of those good consequences where we're being molded and shaped in the image of God and being sanctified and stuff. So anyway, I hope that's clear. I hope that helps you out. God bless you.